Hola, buenas tardes a todos y todas.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Bienvenidos a
Welcome.
evento que forma parte
Welcome to this event that is part of our CIPE series of the future of work in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you for assisting. Today, we will focus on setting up corporations or companies in Latin America and the pandemics and the impact that it has on workers and also on issues that have to do with artificial intelligence. Today we are focused more on Argentina. This event was set up with our partners of the Center for Implementation of Public Policies for Growth, CIPE. And what we will deal with now, or what we will try to answer, is two issues. The first is, where is Argentina with regards to the technological adaptation? And the second question is, how are their workers, are they ready to face these challenges? Today we have two presentations and two experts. The first would be Ramiro Abril, who is the chief investigator of CIPE, and he's also the organizer of the task force of G20 or T20, which is technological change in the future of work, and it's part of G20, which this year is sponsored by Italy. And the second presenter would be Irene Brambilla. She's also a professor at the University of St. Andrews. She investigates issues on trade, international trade, and the behavior of companies. So what we will do, we'll offer 10 to 15 minutes to each person for them to present, and then we move on to chat a little bit about the topic and answer any questions that may come from the people.
You'll find at the bottom of your screen a button for interpretation, so you can press that button and you can select between Spanish and English. Bueno, avanzamos. Doy la palabra a Ramiro para empezar.
Okay,
Ramiro?
let's start now. Thank you, Sean. I will share some evidence and I'll talk a little bit about the pandemics, and I will say that a lot of what I will mention seem to be a faraway future, but what the pandemics did was accelerate the times and bring that future to the table very quickly. So many of the things that I will show you here and the information that I will share about Argentina have to do with a more long-term discussion, but with the pandemics are something that even have to do with how the Argentinian economy will recover in the short term. So I will not spoil Sean's responses right now, John's, but my presentation is a call to action. Because I think that when you look at the information about Argentina, the status quo is not an option if we want to take advantage of the window of opportunities of new technologies to generate better sources of labor. But we change what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I think that we will, if we don't act fast, then we'll lose this opportunity. But it is a call to action. So you can focus on the topic from different points of view. The first thing is measure or gauge the opportunity, the technology. There's a discussion in the world on if this change can increase productivity or not, if it's similar to other technology changes in the sense of they trigger accelerated growth or not. In that sense, we did a research paper a couple of years ago for Latin America, trying to, well, this is very technical, but we altered the models of growth, of traditional growth, and that we use as economists to generate different scenarios associated to the adoptions of technology. So what we found for Argentina is that moving forward, of course, it's a positive scenario. Look towards the right. This would be an absorption of technology similar to that, to the third industrial revolution in Asia in the 90s. A sort of miracle experience. But to see how far the growth in Argentina would be, it would be about 4.4% of the population that wouldn't grow so much, or that GDP per capita would have to, well, we'd have to go back to the 60s to find something like this. Obviously, this is an opportunity. If we could ride on the global technological growth, then artificial intelligence would allow us to use it in different sectors and different processes, and the growth could be accelerated. And that's the growth per year. It would go from 3% on average to 4.4. Imagine that altogether in a couple of decades, then the relative GDP of Argentina could go to, I don't know, half of that of the US, while today it's less than a third. So that's the opportunity. Now the question is, well, what is needed? What is needed to ride on this? And that's where we see some issues that Sean mentioned about the change of technology in Argentina, of the performance of adoption of technologies in Argentina. First thing we can say is that we have an infrastructure problem. The assets that are behind the technological change, well, Argentina does not provide enough of them. Here's a graph in Spanish, sorry, but it's the amount of 4G radio bases per province per 100,000 population. 5G for us is science fiction. And 5G is what gives you massivity and low latency, and it allows you to connect millions of devices at the same time. Well, Argentina is still not there. So here we are already behind. Public policies should start looking at this seriously. The next thing is, but look at companies. You have to believe me, okay? We were asking ourselves how many companies in Argentina using artificial intelligence. So we did a poll, and this was applied in Brazil and Uruguay. Trying to ask the companies not what do you think about technology, but specifically, do you use technology for this process or that process, just to see what's happening within the companies and not a perception issue. 4 is 4.0, and in the manufacturing process, they said that only 2% of the companies use some type of technology. 4.02%. In Germany, it's 25%. So you can compare things. So the companies in Argentina are far away from understanding what this change is about. This 2%, of course, is large companies. They compete, they export, they have in-house processes of processing skills, but the rest of the companies are too far behind. They will not be able to absorb the ideas and ride on that knowledge. So the first red flag is that we have to move forward at a greater speed. The second has to do with skills. Okay, that's a second important issue. Now I'll tell you what we did here was try to analyze the labor market right now to see what part of the workers has the skills that complement the new technologies. and what portion does not. This has nothing to do with the workers of the future or the long term. We're talking about today, the labor market today. And please notice that on the far right, there's an 18%. That's the percentage of the people who have jobs in Argentina, who have skills that do complement new technologies. So if there's a company now that wants to go and innovate, it will go to that 18%. Please notice that in the US, there's the hollowing out. You have 47% of the US are the blue bars. The workers that do have skills that are far away from the skills that are needed, but then you do have a third of the labor market that is ready to go out and work with the dynamic companies. But Argentina, with the amount of workers that really could today help or support this change, is under 20%. So here you've got an important limitation to taking advantage of what I mentioned before. Obviously, and there's the regulations issue. I'll go fast. We have a labor market that is, a third of it is informal, and the rest is over-regulated, over-taxed. That is another issue that is hard for a company that wants to start working dynamically and in a more flexible way. A third of the labor market requires some type of support for the institutions, but there's 2/3 that are very tight, especially for the private sector, very tight, very heavily regulated. And finally, everything that I said, I did mention that there's an opportunity. I did mention that technology is slow. I did mention that the investment in human capital is, or at least what is required, we need to invest heavily in human capital so that we can move and not lag behind. And I did mention there was regulatory issues, and all of this is in a framework in which Argentina has the highest rate of crisis in the world, basically. Everything I mentioned before is long-term bets. Now, who can think about long-term in an economy? Look at this. This is the frequency of banking crisis. There's 3 and 4, and this is not even updated. So because if not, we'd be even more depressed. But please note that Argentina, or the African countries, some African country and us are in the top of the amount of crisis that we had. Argentina has a drop of the GDP every 3 years in the last 50 years. So who can place their bets in the future? Just change their innovation. We can place our bets in a context where the regulations can be changed all the time. There's a huge challenge here that I think that if we do not solve it, then the other things will not move. I will close with the idea of the call to action. First thing is that because of all this sort of short-term vision and not betting on the future, we do not place our bets on productivity in Argentina. We place our bets on good luck. We don't focus on productivity. China's growing, Brazil, let's ask Brazil to help us, China, but we never talk about what really generates long-term growth. So we have to start focusing at some point on how can we increase productivity, because that's where there's job creation. Second thing associated to this is more government. The governments need to support the private sector to foster technological change. We need public bids, but also financing policies and policies for taking knowledge to companies that are far away from technology, IT change or technology change. There is a discussion that Argentina still must have about how to reform the whole education system, to rethink this and to go towards a more all-encompassing reskilling set. And the final thing is that we need a change in the mindset of the private sector, because if technological change does not happen within the companies, it just won't happen at all. The key player here is the companies, and if we do not manage to have the companies be innovative and interesting and attractive and start incorporating a technology, then anything else we may do will make no sense. So I close with this. I'm sure that Irene will provide more details, but I'll stop here. Thank you, Ramiro. Okay, we're starting to get questions. I will leave most of them to the end of the presentation after Irene. But I have one question here. If the information you're presenting is disaggregated per sector or not? Sure. The information that I posted here are disaggregated, but if somebody wants to write to me privately, I can share the documents. In the case of the use of technologies, we have 6 or 7 sectors of the Argentine economy, and measuring opportunities for growth, we have 5 or 6 sectors, and the job descriptions can also be disaggregated by occupation. So if you write to me in private, yeah, I'll be more than happy to share this information. Perfect, thank you. All right, so now Irene is next. Okay, thank you. I will add to this whole perspective of the adoption of technologies that Ramiro gave with the effect in the labor markets, how to think of the labor markets in this context. I will try to share this. I want to talk about 3 things. With new technologies, we have in mind everything that has to do with digitizing and robo. We have good things and bad things. Well, on the one hand, let's start with the good. That is everything that Ramiro mentioned, that new technology is good. It generates opportunities for growth. On the other hand, the first thing we think is, okay, the future of work, given the technology we have, we have a fear that machines will replace human beings. So then we would have the bad part, and then we have to look at the ugly part. That is, what happens with replacing people by machines in the COVID situation, and how this could accelerate a substitution process. So allow me to show you some numbers from different statistic studies that I did together with different groups of people. I want you to take back different ideas about this. So let's start with the good, okay? Which is, technology is obviously something good. It makes productivity improve, the quality of the products produced by the companies also improves, it lowers costs, and then the companies that adopt technology, well, first of all, they choose to do so, so obviously it's beneficial, and it allows them to expand and grow and decrease their costs, and part of that growth is shared with the workers because of salary negotiation, and because the company is going to do that too. I mean, when the workers see that the company is doing well and negotiates and it wants a part of it too, and there could be a sort of output effect where the company that is growing because it invests in technology will also need workers for marketing or other areas. So all of these are positive outcomes of the investment in technology. And allow me to show you some numbers based on a survey that we did with the Ministry of Labor and Science and Technologies from 2015 to 2017. This is a summary, but the companies that improved in digital technology increased their productivity level by 21% with regards to those that do not invest. The revenues increased by 59%, the wages on average increased by 7.6%, and the employment grew by 7.3%. So the companies that invest in technology pay better salaries because they are more productive, and they do hire more people because they are growing. That revenue is based on better production. That is the good. Now, what is the bad? Technology is adopted because it's less expensive than labor. So the workers that remain employed in the companies are better off. They may have better salaries, but maybe many could be displaced or replaced or laid off or substituted. So the company focuses more on the machines and less on the worker. In this process, the unskilled workers are the most vulnerable because they're not too good with machines and they don't know how to use them. I lost her. I don't know if it's just me. Technology displaces workers. 10%. There's more demand. Excuse me, we have some issues apparently. We lost Irene.
Mientras que esperemos que se reconecta, ojalá puede
While
pasar.
we wait for her to connect again,
Quizás tenemos unas varias preguntas que pertenece a la.
we have several questions. I don't know if you've seen some of the questions in the Q&A, but about the data and the impact, who wins and who loses on, you know, with regards to investment companies or some sectors, or who's more impacted by these trends. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Sí, sí.
While we wait.
Empiezo por la primera que veo se refiere
I'll start by the first I see. It has to do with what type of skills are complementary to new technologies. There's a methodology that two Oxford authors did, Carl Frey and Martin Osborne. They choose 3 skill sets. The main has to do with
blandas y creativas. Después hay una
creative skills and soft skills, and the other one has to do with the resilience, and the third has to do with fast movement
de las manos en pequeños
from the hands or
creo que todavía las
in small
manos no
spaces.
logran hacer.
It's something that machines can still not do. The fast movement of hands in small spaces. And obviously, this was criticized, but it was done by a large group of technologists that would study where the bottlenecks are for machines. And the bottlenecks is what was limiting was, so basically one bottleneck was what do we do with the people after the production process. I can send you the link to that document that was published in 2017. And after that, we started discussing and finding that skill set that complemented technologies that are data intensive, like the one that we mentioned. About the second question, how do we incorporate STEM in the formal education? Well, here in Argentina, it's the same. There's a lot of discussion on how to change the curriculum and where does STEM go in. Do we put it in the high school education or elementary and the rest? But the discussion here is a bit different, maybe, in the sense that there's one part of the Argentinian made up by some private schools and higher, elite private schools that have already incorporated STEM, digital curriculum, and they've also included creativity and such. And the rest, for the mass of public schools, they still are too far away because the teachers are not ready, because there's no connectivity in the schools, and for many other factors that made the discussion be a bit delayed. So the issue is there. It is within the discussions, but we still cannot manage to move forward in reforming the curriculum or the infrastructure and such, so that we can effectively generate the reform. Meanwhile, a small group of institutions is in the avant-garde, and they do have an advantage over most of the other schools. That has to do with the second point. The third issue,
diferencia por si hay un sesgo de género con respecto
if there's anything that has to do with gender,
a las empresas, nos hubiese gustado.
With regards to the owners of companies, we would have loved to have asked that, but when we did the poll, we did add this between us, and we were a bit late, but we wanted to ask about gender. There's some other data that shows that the companies directed by women usually take more risks, at least in Argentina, but we didn't ask this. I think I answered the 3 questions that were there in the Q&A. Thank you. I think that Irene is connected again, so please go ahead. This was a practical, this was a great example of the connectivity issues we have in Argentina. So I was showing you, here we were. So I had showed you how some workers are replaced and some occupations are eliminated. We had done several studies about this, and there's literature on this, identifying the winners and the losers of this whole process of adopting technology. And the way we think about this is on a routine-based approach. This says that technology, computers and robots, are based on codes. They need codes. So a code has to be written where you tell the machine what to do. Therefore, the task that machine does is complex, but it has to be a routine, and it has to be codable. It has to have a set of instructions. So who are the workers at risk? Those that perform tasks that follow an algorithm. And who is not at risk? Well, the creative ones, the problem solvers, the supervisors, those that have to engage in interpersonal communication with clients, with colleagues. So when we need human input, that is where there's less risk. When there is a repetitive task, well, that's where there's more risk. So we have worked in several studies where in what we know as what has to do with all of these occupations or what tasks, we have estimated a risk. And this is what Ramiro was talking about, how they calculate risks per occupation. And based on this, we can talk about the workers and look at demographics of the workers that are more at risk. So look at this. We don't care so much. I mean, we compare the different groups, see where we have the different skill sets. Those that are more at risk are clearly the unskilled workers, those that have no high school education. Semi-skilled are those that have a high school education, and skilled are the university degrees population. So the risk of automation falls for the skilled. For the skilled, it drops to the middle, because these are the people that have to do, cognitive, non-repetitive skills, while the unskilled workers are doing more manual labor, repetitive, and be cognitive but repetitive, such as the desk of an airline. You can go, you don't need a person, you can do check-in with a computer now. If we look at gender, there's not major differences for men and women. It's similar, and then the other variable, we see differences in the age. Look here. This is very interesting. If we take the young workers from 15 to 24 years of age, they have a risk that drops quite a bit for the 25 to 40 age group, and then that risk increases again. What happens here? There's two different effects. First of all, in this group, we've got workers who are too young and per definition are unskilled, basically, most of them. And they don't have a lot of experience, so they do routine work. You know, when they start, they follow orders. So people acquire more flexibility and they are less easy to substitute. When does it start going up? Why do those that are 60 or older are more? But that has to do with the process of changing the cuts in Latin America, how the workers are more skilled. So this does not mean that it is the career path of a person, that the risk of one person will increase. But we are comparing different generations where the generation from 25 to 40 have more skill sets than those from 65 or more. So the more vulnerable workers here, the unskilled workers, are those that have more risk, are more at risk. And this can be seen also if we organize the workers from the 1% who is the poorest to the richest. This is the risk of automatization. See how it drops here dramatically. Here in the top, it's basically similar, but as we add the skilled workers, then this risk drops. So our conclusion is that the winners and losers are easy to predict, at least in general terms. The more vulnerable the worker is with regards to incomes and skill sets, they will be at a higher risk because it's harder for them to work together with technology. Now, well, I don't want to go on for too long, but what happened with COVID-19? In Argentina, there was a very strict quarantine, one of the strictest in the world. Most of the people were not able to work during many months. And naturally, this placed labor at risk because it's an expense for their workers without producing anything. In these circumstances, labor or the equation that the companies do of saying, okay, should I invest in technology? Well, that tips the balance in favor of technology. What we did in this study is say, okay, which workers are most vulnerable? As we said before, those that are performing repetitive tasks, but also those that suffered the most during the quarantine. Who are they? Those that need to work in close proximity with others, because that makes them obviously there's a sanitary risk, and those that cannot work remotely. The people that cannot continue working, people who during the quarantine were not able to work because of sanitary risks. There were issues and they were not able to work remotely. And look at these numbers. Look at all these people in Argentina and Latin America are in this situation. For example, this is the impossibility of working remotely. Look at this percentage. In Argentina, 71.5% have no possibilities of working remotely or from home. Almost 100% of the people in Argentina work in close proximity with others. So they have to work closely to others. This makes it that there are very vulnerable. There are people who are very vulnerable, and if we identify the people that do repetitive work, that have to work in close proximity with others, and that cannot work remotely, we can see how this is related again with the income, and we will see that the most vulnerable ones during the pandemics are again all those that have lower incomes, and that vulnerability drops dramatically towards the end. So the conclusion of all of this is, on the one hand, technology is good, and as Ramiro says, we have to use this wave, we cannot stop it. On the other hand, we see that it may have consequences on the income level, because the victims, so to say, of technology are the unskilled laborers who will have a harder time finding work again. So this is a call to action, because yes, we have to invest in technology, but we have to take care of those that are displaced by technology because they are the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias a los dos. Son datos
Thank you.
interesantes y te dejan
It's very,
en cómo se puede resolver.
this makes you, I mean, it's just food for thought. And
de uno de los participantes.
so one of the questions is,
en saber todo
one of the questions is, in all of these, in all, are there initiatives in Argentina to close this gap, especially for the most vulnerable ones, the unskilled workers or the others? Are there examples of programs of education, of training to improve the situations?
Tal vez nos pueda comentar mejor Ramiro, pero
maybe Ramiro can mention this. I don't know of any programs. Something else I want to say. The COVID-19 situation has also had a positive side in the sense that it has forced a lot of people to invest in learning a little bit more on digital work, on working from home. And a clear example is the teachers. The teachers had to give online classes, and they have had to teach their students about online classes, and this could have a consequence in the long term. Argentina, well, adopting technology is very low. The knowledge of technology is very low, except in hierarchy levels. But in workers with high skilled, like maybe teachers, their level of use of technology is not too good. So this could be something positive. It has forced a lot of people who used to say, I hate computers, to have to say, well, I will have to use computers, because if not, I can't carry on working. So I'm also answering Indra's question, because she asked something similar. She said, I don't know training courses that are specific to this, but yes, there are some people that had to forcefully train themselves, starting with teachers and students who have been using computers much more often than they used to in Argentina. Yes, and about what Irene was saying, there are cases that are very interesting about experiences of basically the private sector on the one hand. There's a case called Arbusta. I don't know if you know it. It's a company that trains young people of vulnerable areas so that they can be some part of a productive process or digital process, such as in arts or the movies. In that case, all digital products need skill sets, programmers and such, but you also need back office, you also need a group of a task force. They don't really need a title or a university degree. So I mentioned Arbusta, but there's many of these that are closely following, because in some way they manage to at least integrate the vulnerable population into the dynamic sectors. And once they start training project, they learn by doing, and at least they get a different point of view. I mentioned Arbusta, but then there's another part of close to Buenos Aires that also started to work with the cinema industry, and they have a company now where they fix computers and such. They always with the lowest part. These are cases that, I mean, it's complicated because they require a sort of agreement between one technological company and some public office or some authority. They require some engineering that is complex, but there are cases that are interesting. And also, if you're interested in them, then I can send them to you, some in the rural areas as well. And the question and the challenge there is how to escalate, or how to go from the isolated cases to some kind of scheme that works in more and wider contexts. There's not a lot of progress there. Public and private participation or the whole group, there's some cases where there's connectivity that can be taken to some regions and skill sets for non-natives, the demographics of the workers that are older, that they are taking place now, but these experiences are pilot projects, are isolated, and they are not part of the public policies. Thank you. Ramiro, while we are talking about the role of the public sector and the government, are there regulatory or policy barriers in the adoption of technology, or is it just an educational issue? Irene, do you want to answer, or? I think that in Argentina, there's a wide, okay, there's a huge number of issues. The larger companies have in-house training, and they can, but their problem is, I mean, they need the private sector, they need the public sector as well. They need, obviously, the support of public policies. The more middle class companies, so to speak, are those companies that do not, there's no talent, okay? In Argentina, there's no way for a company that's growing to get talent to digitize without stealing that resource from another company. So that's a restriction for the middle class companies. Same thing happens with financing. You need capital risk to think in innovating in a large scale in the technology, and then there's a barrier. Then you've got smaller companies that have many difficulties. They have no, I mean, it's hard for them to find human resources. They don't even know what the discussion is about. They have no idea, no clue about technology. So we have some restrictions that are irrational. If you want to buy 50 computers together, it's hard. Just little things like that. You won't be able to find 50 computers for your company. So there's some things that go beyond what I mentioned that have to do with the scarcity of resources, and that has to do with infrastructure. I would like to add the whole import part of all of this. It goes beyond the issue of currency. There's taxes, import taxes that are important, but are uncertain as well, because they change, because the rules of the game change constantly. The taxes for computers have dropped and then gone back up and then gone back down, and it's all of this creates uncertainty, and it's hard to foresee anything because all of this technology is imported. And I say computers as something that's not so sophisticated or more simple to understand, but with any other types of devices or spare parts or anything, same thing happens. So it's hard to predict from taxes to well, we've had a recent story of prohibition. So even though there are some things that at some point a company could leap over these hurdles, there is a general context on public policies that is quite uncertain. One of the things that we will talk about in another event for the future of work is, well, what we see in the developed nations like the US and Europe. Can we, there's a lot of trade can be done digitally. We have the infrastructure of banking and credit cards and all of that is set. And this could facilitate this process. But do you have any, perspective about this, or do you have anything that can facilitate this change? Irene, do you want to answer, or?
Completas, Ramiro. Bueno, dos cosas
Okay, I'll start, then you complete this. Last years, there's been a sort of boom in digital trade that was quite late. I think 20 years after that in the US. I moved to the US in 1997, and Amazon was just beginning. Here, Mercado Libre is equivalent, and it started growing just in the past few years. So the digital payment system was finally adopted by small companies, small businesses that use this system, this payment system, and this has allowed a lot of people, a lot of small companies to be able to be part of online trade. And that is something that is expanding, and it's quite recent, so the last 2 or 3 years. And I also wanted to highlight something else that happened relatively recently. The government declared the communication services as an essential asset. And what that means is that it will regulate the price of telecommunications, of cell phones, etc. And this obviously, on the one hand, seeks for it to be affordable to more people, but on the other hand, a huge concern is that it will be a limit for the investment of the quality of these services and to continue improving the infrastructure, etc. Because the idea is that this regulation will make the prices affordable, but they will not invest. So there's a sort of trade-off, and we want all of Argentinians to have access to internet. But there is a small uncertainty of what will the quality of the internet be like for all of us in the next few years. Yes. Along those lines, I think that COVID-19, what COVID-19 did is change how we were used to crisis, because crisis used to have to do with banking institutions and financial institutions that were non-banking, such as the ones that Irene just mentioned, was an innovation that changed the rules of the game a bit. The crisis went somewhere else this time. They were competing with better set companies such as banks that had some privileges, and that is, I think there's no turning back in that. So I do agree with Irene, and I agree with the teachers, and I would add that in trade, same thing happened, and in many sectors too. They did not want to use digital technology because they had to trust a bank, and the banks were always part of the crisis, but now you must be digital and you have to trust the bank. So this will generate a change, and the dividends will be starting to, I think there's no turning back. About the second point, it's also very interesting to bring this to the table because there's companies here that have to take risks, and if the return on investment is the public sector, or there's no return on investment, who will take that risk? So this discussion pops up. If we need the technology companies to start to innovate as well, to expand their infrastructure, to give flexible solutions to more complex issues beyond the digital world, that has a cost and it entails a risk. So at the same time, the government says you must have a low tariff, then nobody will take on the risk, and the result will be bad if we don't design this better. That's where we have some good things that make us come close to that world, but we are lagging behind. But at the same time, there's some signs that show us that this process will be slow and there will be a delay because the signs, there are no incentives there. Thank you both. We have very few minutes left. So I want to ask if, okay, there's a couple of questions that have to do with the investors. What's the message for investors that are outside Argentina? Is there, for example, in the US, we have a new government. There's issues of international trade that can be achieved with regards to bilateral agreements to support these tasks. Okay. I think that obviously the world gives us some opportunities again with regards to the, I mean, Argentina, yes, is very affordable, very cheap now for the rest of the world. And that also gives us opportunities because the price of commodities didn't drop as far as we thought it would. Trade didn't drop, and finances are giving zero rate. You know, the credits are cheap in the world, so that did benefit Argentina, but it's up to us to give the first steps. And that's where I think we still need to be more clear on where is the economic program going to, what do we need, what agreements will we have with the world, and if everything settles and the COVID impact and the negotiations, etc. I think that in the next months we will be able to think in the long term, and maybe there will be some productive plan or how will we move forward, and then there will be room for opportunity. Because so far I don't think this is available. Yes, we are cheap. Yes, we are, I think, for investors, but it's still not clear where we are going or where we're headed to. So maybe you have to wait a little bit to know. Irene, any comment? Yes, I just want to add similar terms to what Ramiro was saying. Definitely, it is cheap right now to invest in Argentina. But the reason why it's cheap, it's because of this huge uncertainty. It's not just financial, it's also institutional and political. So it's a moment that the country is going through that is very complicated. There will be elections in mid next year, and I think that there will be a sort of freeze to that moment, because that's the time that people will have to stop and say, well, I support this direction, I support that direction. And I think that to that moment, a more reasonable thing would be to think that the investors would wait to see how things evolve in Argentina. That has always been the rule in the last years in Argentina. There's always been a great fear about what happens in politics. It's not just the macro lack of stability, but also institutionality. And so there has been a lot of fear, and that has led the country to be sort of in a sort of paralysis. And I think that the elections, the legislative elections next year should be a continuation or a total change, depending on the results. Thank you. Well, one of the reasons why we present this series of events and blogs and podcasts, the future work from our center, CIPE, is that we do not have the answers to all of these huge questions. So it is a challenge for everyone. And through dialogue and through the, presenting information such as you have done today, then we can try and answer all of these big questions. So I encourage you to follow us on Twitter. We've already added the Twitter account there, so you can follow us. And please join us for future events to answer all of these big questions. So now I want to thank both of you who presented this information so well. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Thank you, Ramiro. Thank you, Irene. And I hope that you, the participants, can assist and can come back in the future to further events. Have a great afternoon. Thank you. Thank you,
Estuvo linda
John,
la
for the
discusión.
invitation.
Esperemos que
It was a good discussion. I hope that people have been entertained and informed. I'm sure they have. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.